Hello, everyone. My name is Mika, and I'm really delighted to be here with Jeffrey Deitch and with Rika Hiro. I just wanted to briefly introduce the panelists. So Jeffrey, as you all know, has had an illustrious career being involved in modern and contemporary art for the last 50 years as an artist, writer, curator, dealer, advisor, and I think most well known really for Deitch projects, where he's produced more than 250 projects. And also following that as director of Museum of Contemporary Art here in Los Angeles from 2010 to 2013, and now has reestablished his art advisory and gallery. And what I'd love to talk about actually today is his involvement with Japan, which goes back all the way to 1969 when he was a high school exchange student in Kyoto. And he also curated the influential exhibition Strange Abstraction in Tokyo in 1991. And has shown many Japanese artists in solo and thematic exhibitions, including the 1993 Venice Biennale. Rika Hiro is Associate Curator of Japanese Art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Her expertise is in modern contemporary Japanese art. She co-founded the nonprofit art space Art 2102 in Los Angeles, and has co-curated at the Getty Research Institute Art, Anti-Art, Non-Art, Experimentations in the Public Sphere in Postwar Japan 1950 to 70, and Radical Communication, Japanese Video Art 1968 to 1988. Rika and I actually met in 1999, around then, when we were, well, I was an intern at LACMA, in the Japanese art department, and then we, as grad students, worked on the art anti-art, non-art symposium with a cohort of many now quite well-known scholars of post-war Japanese art, including those who've introduced Gutai, Fluxus, Monoha, High-Red Center, and so we've kind of, for the last over 25 years, have seen the field grow. So I want to begin. We have a few slides. This is kind of rough, pretty loose, but just to go over some themes that really have been, I think, important in terms of the emergence of contemporary Japanese art. And, jumping off of the last conversation that we had heard between Ed Shad and Takashi Murakami, it is no secret that Murakami is a dynamic and very, very critical figure. I actually had the great chance to work on copyright Murakami at MoCA under Paul Schimmel. And so I wanted to just introduce some of the key ways in which Murakami has, in his way as an artist and I would say a philosopher, reintroduced, ways to look at contemporary art through the lens of very, important Japanese traditional practices that he has made accessible through contemporary pop motifs. And this is 727, which was the cover of the catalog. And as you can see, he draws a lot from important, this is a Heian period Shikisan Engi hand scroll. So he really is a historian more than anything, and the way in which he kind of subtly incorporates the narrative aspects of these early Japanese art, pieces into his work. And not only does he kind of connect the past, but also with the present. And so he mentioned Yoshinori Kanada, who created Galaxy Express 999. And when I worked on the show, I realized how he is formally, through his work, connecting, these very important works from the 17th century all the way through the present, and how those forms, infiltrate in a way subliminally through our, through anime, through film, through culture, and through subcultures. So the My Lonesome Cowboy, which is one of his signature pieces from 1998, this was actually drawn from the subculture of figurines and the otaku culture, and he really wanted to kind of flatten out the high and the low, and the different kind of cultures that could not be really seen as part of the fine art realm, especially in Japan. But how those elements could be seen together, and that was kind of his language that he introduced in his own practice. Another thing that I wanted to also discuss with the panel is that Takashi is very concerned with the place of contemporary Japanese art within the global world of contemporary, and so he. There was this term, infantile capitalism, that he would talk about with the post-war period in Japan, because there's, a very specific history of avant-garde practices. So he's very comedic, and so he would restage some of these very important works, performances, for example, by Gutai or by High Red Center. And this was a street performance that High Red Center did in 1964, right around the time of the Tokyo Olympics, where the history of World War II was basically being sanitized. And so Murakami, 30 years later, restaged this in Osaka, kind of like as a hilarious gesture, cleaning up the streets, just to see how that would actually translate as a form of critique, or as a form of radical performance in the 1990s. So, so that was kind of the bridge between the last panel, and I wanted to first, ask Rika just briefly about your, you also were a correspondent for BT, which is the significant Japanese, like the art forum of Japan, for a long time, based in LA, writing about contemporary art here. So from, your perspective, can you talk a little bit about how, that began, and your also, opening up your space, and just a brief history of your encounter with contemporary Japanese art.
The brief history can be expansive, but of course, compared to yours, Jeffrey, mine is really minor. Before I start my brief history, I just want to comment on what Murakami-san had just shown and Mika has just expanded. Especially the super flat. I know Edo mentioned and explained it quite beautifully that the super flat visual is really deflattening the culture, and that really speaks to what Mika just mentioned. Murakami is interested in post-war Japan and Japan's experience of defeat. And then also how Hiroshige, his series of 100 Views of Edo, was his response to the flattened Tokyo after a big earthquake. So in a way, like it's a kind of like, these artists, ukiyo-e printmaker back in 19th century, and Takashi Murakami active at the end of 20th and the 21st centuries. He is really sharing that concept too, and an attitude, and I found it so beautiful to see, especially when I see it at bigger screen, and it's like, oh wow, maybe there are connections between them. And then my connection there is very minimal, but this is something that I very revere Murakami-san throughout his career, through his art, but also writing and curation. He is really, trans-historically approaching his creativity, and then it also like concerned the position of contemporary Japanese art. And before this panel, we had a small conversation where I began my career or my encounter with Japanese contemporary art. I wasn't to study art or art history in the beginning when I was an undergrad, but I was very much interested in looking at art. But growing up in countryside, art was something not my own part of life. But when I came to Tokyo, and art and film or subcultures are all expanded, and I got so excited. And I started working at the museum, starting with department museum. And then eventually, one of my jobs was at Contemporary Art Museum in Tokyo when it opened first in 1995. The inaugural exhibition was Japanese art from 1985 to 1995. So that was my first, I guess, more official encounter with Japanese contemporary art. But I was always interested in more, let's say, Japan's experience of post-war, etc. So that drew me back to a little bit toward more out of 1960s and 70s. But so I had these, two sort of interests, contemporary art, but also a more traditional, more political art as well. So when I came here here means in the US as a grad student, I had an opportunity, a lucky opportunity to write for Deitch. That's the very first contemporary art magazine in Tokyo, launched it back in 1948, immediately after the post-war. I think one of the very first contemporary art-focused art magazine in the world, as I believe. And for that, I have to look at contemporary art general, but also as a Japanese living in the US, I've been always interested in how Japanese artists were doing. And then I thought that one of the response was perhaps to open a space, but not just by myself, but with a group of people. So that was me and a Korean adoptee and one artist from Basque Country, and then another curator and gallerist from Switzerland. So 4 of us running this space called Art 2102. That's, we could say a lot about it. Okay, it's art in 21st century, etc., but it's really the address of the space. But a learning space with no budget, it was really tough. So we started back in 2003, but it lasted. My involvement was only 2 years, and then probably we oversaw about 11 exhibitions and events, including a film screening curated by Sharon Hayes, and I curated Miho Hagino exhibition that is about a show of 2 artists who happen to have the same name, but one lives in the US, the other lived in Mexico, and we invited someone named very similar, but not artist, but an economist in Japan, Ogino Miho, who in Japanese character looks very similar, and then talk about the identity or what does that mean by name or having the same name in the creative world. So yeah, so maybe next slide. And then very briefly, I try to go faster. This is one exhibition I curated or co-curated for the Getty Art Institute. It was a very minor, a small-scale show, but what we wanted to do is to, one, as the title suggests, it's very mouthful, long title, Art, Anti-Art, No-Art, Experimentations in the Public Sphere in Postwar Japan, 1950s to 1970s. And it does tell pretty much everything, but we want to focus on avant-garde art in post-war and the post-occupation period in Japan. And also the idea was to focus on collectives rather than individual artists. So there are a number of, as Mika, you mentioned, the Gutai, Hiro Center, and not Monoha, but Fluxus and experimental musicians. And by doing so, especially with the collection of Getty Research Institute, the majority of artworks or ephemeral works were already in the Getty's archive, which suggests that the artists were very vigorously communicating, responding each other. So the remnants were already embedded in the Getty's archive, and we only added photography and the photo books for the show. And then maybe the next slide. And then the hidden theme was Tokyo versus Osaka, and then that was the one with the themes that we pondered for a long time, whether we should stick to the theme, but it wasn't really working well. A lot of artists were active in Tokyo, but also there were interesting experiments happening in Osaka and elsewhere in local world. But in the end, we dropped the theme invisible, but we were hoping to draw some connections and diversions between things that were happening in Tokyo and elsewhere in Japan. And then, as I said, more importantly, and this show was, I think, to see how strong Japan was present outside of Japan already back in the 50s and the 60s, and even through a small ephemeral work that ended up in Getty Research Institute collection.
Right, like the slide on the left is Fujiko Nakaya's work at the expo, at the
Osaka Expo.
Osaka Expo 1970, and then Art and Technology,
right,
which has a huge presence in the Getty.
Right, so
there was a recent exhibition, actually. Right?
And then Nakaya Fujiko fog sculpture has been really popular around the world, right?
Yes.
Tate or Germany, etc. So it's great to be able to...
You can see it at the Guggenheim Bilbao.
Yes. At the permanent?
Permanent sculpture outside.
Yeah. And then, and this is a kind of another connection between Mika and me. This was another Paul Schimmel's curated exhibition, Destroy the Picture, and Mika was initially research assistant for the show, but you took a position at Hirschhorn, right? So she contacted me if I could, took over, and so I did. And I think the beauty of this exhibition was that, as the title show, how the artists purposefully destroyed the painting as a way to expand the painting and expand the post-war art as a response to, again, World War II and the violence against the humanities, and also enduring threat of nuclear war. And then here, Saburo Murakami's or Gutai artist, one of the Gutai artists, work to cover the entrance of the exhibition with painted craft paper. And you have to break the painting in order to see the exhibition, in order to see the art and the history. And it was actually very hard to break it. And Paul Simel, he was bounced back in the initial try. And he's a big guy, and he couldn't break it, so he has to really punch it and then do a little bit of trick to break it.
Right. This literal breakthrough was also a reenactment that Takashi Murakami did back in the 90s.
So there's another connection.
Yes, because of the similar last name.
Right. And then from here on, I want to talk a little bit about LACMA. And as I said, we are trying to do a more trans-historical approaches to Japanese art. And going back to the history of LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, there are some of the important shows of Japan that were featured outside of Japan. And one was this one, Primal Spirit. That focused on 10 Japanese sculptures. And that's amazing to see the exhibition that focused just about the sculpture. It's quite a commitment to do so. Curated by Howard Fox, who was a contemporary curator. But in the preparation of this slide, I read that this was organized by Japanese art department. So I have to dig a little bit of the history of it. But this was also known for a kind of problematic, or there was a kind. They got a severe criticism too. One, because as you can see, these sculptures were primarily made by wood or natural material like wood, stone, charcoal, water. But that was considered to be as a move to take Japan, or making or mystifying Japan, or essentializing Japanese culture as nature-loving people and culture. And unfortunately, that sometimes still happens in the curatorial world, especially to do with traditional Japanese art.
Yeah, and we'll talk about this later, but the same year, there's a kind of almost opposite kind of show called Against Nature, which traveled throughout, across the U.S., organized by Kathy Halbreich and Tom Sokolowski, and also Japan Foundation. It was really an effort to promote more technology-oriented, advanced, contemporary works, which we'll talk about too.
Sure. And then another fun exhibition curated by LACMA, then LACMA's contemporary curator, Lenza Lebansky, Kusama Yayoi Kusama's Love Forever. And I was still in Japan at that time, but I knew that was held by LACMA. So that was one of the kind of inspiration for me to, okay, LACMA has Jakuchu, a famous Edo period painting, and then doing this kind of thing, so I want to go to LA. Although I missed it, but again, in the preparation of this slide, I didn't know Yayoi Kusama did Narcissus Garden outside LACMA. How fun is that? I wish I could be there, or LACMA can do it again.
This was actually my first show that I saw of Kusama, and then I organized a few recently.
Yeah, you did. And then this is a link to Jeffrey Deitch. In your contribution, I learned that you were one of the key person behind this exhibition, Mariko Mori, presentation on LACMA, and likewise acquiring her work afterwards. So I'm not going to mention anything further on that. And then more recently, LACMA staged Summer Francis and Japan. It's really to see Summer Francis well, Japan in San Francisco, and it's not just contemporary artists' work and that San Francisco is surrounded, but it also traditional art. And it also, for Japanese artists' point of view, San Francisco was key contact to learn about art in US and Europe too. And then a little bit about LACMA in the future. I know many of you know that we are opening a new building, whether you like it or hate it. It is happening, and it's an exciting thing for me. And for that, not within the new building, but outside of it, we will have Shio Kusaka, who is a LA-based artist who primarily works on fire clay and ceramic art. But for the first time, she is going to make a large-scale public sculpture called Beam. As you can see, it's going to be a fun sculpture outside the building, so you can visit when even LACMA is closed. And then the last one is another public art, and Mika has a lot to do with it. We recently acquired Susumu Kushimizu, one of the key monoha artists, recreation of 1970 original 13-ton split rock, and we are planning to locate it outside of Japanese pavilion of LACMA, which is currently closed, but we are very much working toward the opening of it.
Thank you. I wanted to, that it's so interesting to see, your history and then how LACMA, I mean, it's very brief, obviously there's more, but just how the ways in which contemporary Japanese art or post-war Japanese art has been disseminated is really, it seems, through, like, in the recent 20 years, it's been more from this archival, work that has then elevated through to museums, research institutes, and then, it's because of key people, key players who have curated these shows that we've been able to see exhibitions such as Kusama and Marika Mori. And I think that takes us to your contribution, Jeffrey, of how important your history has been. And when we worked together in 2019, because you were one of the biggest lenders for my exhibition, Paragon, which focused on Japanese art of the 1980s and 90s. And that show, it was actually an interest that I had since undergrad. But because of the state of contemporary art history in universities, I wasn't able to write my dissertation on it or even curate a show like that at museums because there wasn't enough expertise or knowledge. And it was, it was, and finally at a gallery is where I was able to stage the exhibition. And we mentioned Against Nature and Primal Spirit, but these were the kind of key exhibitions in the late 80s when the emergence of contemporary Japanese art was really at, I think, its height in the US. You might not, you might speak otherwise, but, and in 1994, Scream Against the Sky, which was the massive kind of encyclopedic exhibition at the Guggenheim. I'm going to just go through this very quickly. The show, which was at Blum, or Blum and Poe, where it was called Paragon because of the gallery in Tokyo that had really, it was at the crux between modern and postmodernism in the 80s. And they really tried to kind of introduce subversive and critical art practices dealing with art of the time. And, I think that Murakami's Super Flat was very important in terms of the consciousness of Japanese art in the late 90s and 2000s. And the impact of that has been huge. There's still, there are a lot of other narrative histories. And so I wanted to also, at the time, neo-pop, which was more like the larger kind of overarching term that, included artists like Murakami, Yukinori Yanagi, even Marika Mori, and Kenji Yanobe, who were dealing with different issues like the nuclear crisis and issues of images and also conceptual practices that appropriated a lot of kind of everyday objects. But I just Jeffrey's the work by Noboru Tsubaki, which is the big the yellow piece called Fresh Gasoline, was one of the biggest works in the exhibition that I think was not shown since it was shown in the 90s. So, okay, so with that, I wanted to ask Jeffrey your first encounters with Japan, and I know we have a lot of slides of some of the exhibitions that you have curated, but can you talk about your first, encounters as well?
Oh, thank you, Mika. Well, first, it's such an honor to host the group here in my gallery, and the Asia Society Southern California is such a dynamic organization. Brian has invited me to several of the galas, and it's one of the most exciting, dynamic, cultural, intellectual forces here in Southern California. So thank you very much for inviting me for this panel, and again, welcome to the gallery. So my involvement with Japan started when I was 16 years old. I had the great fortune to be asked to participate in an exchange student program in Kyoto. And 1969 was a very special year because traditional Japan, particularly in Kyoto, was still very present. And many of the women wore traditional kimono and wooden clogs, and so I was able to experience some of the old Japan as well as the modernizing Japan. And I was so enthralled, and when I got back to America as a high school student, I clipped out every news report on Japan from the newspaper and saved them in a shoebox. And so I've been immersed in Japanese culture, politics, ever since I was a teenager. So my involvement is both on the curatorial side and the art market side. So I think, interesting to talk about both. So I had the very good fortune in the 1980s to be invited by one of the great trading companies, Itochu, to be their partner for the art trade. And Itochu, many of you know, trading company most involved with fashion and culture, and they wanted to get involved in fine art because particularly the late 80s, Japan was the center of the art boom. And many of the major works of art in New York auctions were bought by Japanese, and it was the height of the bubble period in the economy, but also the bubble period in art. So through Itochu, I became the most active dealer in Western contemporary art in Japan. It was an amazing ride. And some years I would make 5 trips and placed a lot of important art in public collections, private collections. Unfortunately, almost all of the great art that I helped to place in private corporate collections came back after the bubble period collapsed. But I sold amazing works there, like the Jasper Johns White Flag for $20 million, which at the time, 1990, 91, was the most expensive work of contemporary art ever sold. And what I would do, and I would go in and meet with these corporate collectors, very difficult negotiations. I would then relax by going around to the galleries. And in the late 80s, early 90s, the Tokyo contemporary art scene was one of the most dynamic in the world. I would say at the time it was probably beyond Los Angeles. You probably experienced it then. It was amazing. And so the evenings when galleries timed their openings, there were hundreds of people going from one gallery to the other. And that's where I met Takashi Murakami and a number of the artists who were shown in Aperto. It was really thrilling. I was asked to curate an exhibition in something I'd only do in Japan. A real estate company was granted the opportunity to build additional stories on a skyscraper if they would open up a contemporary art museum on the site for a few years as the planning was being done. It was called the Toku Museum. And it was the best location where the top boutiques were, Louis Vuitton, Prada. And I put together a show called Strange Abstraction. And it was such a dynamic time. It was this time when many of the international great artists would be in Tokyo. So the time we opened, Martin Kippenberger, a great German artist, was making prints. John Baldessari from LA was there. It was really amazing. And there was a great history of top artists, Frank Stella, Anselm Kiefer, Jean-Michel Basquiat, going to Japan from the mid to late 80s into the early 90s to do exhibitions and galleries in the department store museums. It was an amazing, dynamic time. And what happened is the contemporary, there was a kind of a collapse very quick. And so I mentioned a lot of the great works of art came back to America. Like the White Flag that I sold for $20 million, they came back to America at a price of $11 million. Now it's in Mike Ovitz's house here in Los Angeles. But that it was very sad because it was I worked hard to get some of these great works there, and the ones in the public museums are there. But even museums that were seen to be like permanent, like Kawamura, well, they're selling their works now in the international market. It took a long time, but.
Were you mostly placing works in private then?
And so the Jasper John was sold to the Isetan department stores. But a number of really good pieces. Rosenquist went to the Contemporary Art Museum in Tokyo. Great Dali went to Hiroshima. There's a lot that stayed there in the public museums. But during the bubble period, for instance, there was a very colorful dealer named Kamayama who would get drunk and go to the auctions, and he was lying on the floor of Sotheby's, bidding on the greatest de Kooning interchange. And so he paid $20 million for that. That came back. It was in David Geffen's collection. I think it's now in Ken Griffith's collection. But yeah, these are some of the icons of contemporary art.
And then you were also writing for Flash Art.
That's right. And then going back to the curatorial side. So I was asked to be one of the curators of this very important aperto, just open, at the Venice Biennale in 1993. And not that many people in the West, in the curatorial side, knew about contemporary Japanese art at that time. And so I'm seeing that what the curators of this section were doing, there were no Japanese artists. And so I said, well, we can't have that. So I invited several Japanese artists, Tsubaki, Nakahara, Yanagi, to create really ambitious works for the aperto, and that was very important. And Yukinori Yanagi won one of the prizes. The work astonished people.
This is the work that's showing right now. It's called
So-
World Flag Ant Farm.
Yeah, he's an amazing artist, and what he does is he builds these ant farms, so they're animated. And just an aside, a story with Yanagi. So I invited him to do an exhibition in a gallery in Korea that I curated. And so his piece, of course, was the North Korean flag and the South Korean flag as ant farms. And what happens is the ants go back and forth, and after a month or two in the show, it all becomes even. You don't see the individual flags anymore. It all becomes the same. So the day before the opening, I go to check things out in the gallery, and there's like 20 police cars, and so they're parked every which way. You know how in a movie when they do a raid, and it was somebody in the gallery told the authorities there's something that is very, very serious here going on. And
So was it never questioned?
and so of course the owner of the gallery did everything she could, but the work was withdrawn. But it's interesting. This is something. And Murakami has this too, that the art seems fun, all that, but there's something really heavy and with a strong political message. Now, something that attracts me about contemporary Japanese art is this flattening. See, it goes back to the Yayoi prints, which is kind of the first pop art, that there is this equivalence between anime, figurines, the serious art. So fine art, the way it's thought of in Europe and America, it's not the same in Japan. Maybe you can talk more about that. There's more of an evenness. So and Murakami is the best example of this, where it's pop culture and fine art, historical art, futuristic art, all combined. The other thing that really interests me in Japanese contemporary art is this fusion of the tradition that a lot of the artists like Murakami, who has a doctoral degree in traditional Nihonga painting, they are very aware of the tradition. So there's the tradition, and then there's the pop culture, and then there's also this tradition of performance. And the contemporary artists particularly go back to Gutai, Buto, and so when Murakami, we've seen, he integrates this performative. So now, very interesting, maybe three of the most famous, most admired artists in the whole world are Japanese. Kusama, Yoko Ono, and Murakami. And the three of them, there's this fusion of the three things. Obviously, Yoko is involved in pop culture with her songs and performing, and Kusama does her bags with Louis Vuitton. And so it's really interesting that Western artists don't have generally the same fusion. So it's something very unique to Japanese art. Now, the other thing I want to mention about these three super famous artists is, well, most of the world, that's what they know about Japanese art. And so there was this boom, and Murakami benefited from it, and then the Japanese art market unfortunately went to sleep for 25 years. And it's reviving now, but I'd like to hear your comment on it. So we don't know internationally so many of the younger artists after Murakami. And for the historic artists, there have been these great shows, a few of them like Shiraga, who makes amazing paintings with his feet, gets high prices, but most of that is still very obscure.
Well, there's Nara.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
he's actually older than Murakami, and they
Yeah.
lived together in Los Angeles when they were teaching at UCLA in 1998. So, but of course, that is also, of a certain generation.
Well, there's something that's very interesting. So when you take these three people I mentioned and Nara, see, they all made the effort to come to America. So obviously Yoko, so Kusama spent a lot of time in a decade in America in the 50s into the 60s, was really part of the scene, and Takashi teaching at UCLA, making friends with Paul McCarthy. So that's something that's very significant that not so many other artists have done.
Well, can I ask a question, Jeffrey? So you still work with a number of great young Japanese artists, and are they willing to venture to come here, or how is your working with them?
Just I was very lucky to show Mariko Mori back in the 90s, and other wonderful Japanese artists. More recently, we've done these projects with a gallery in Tokyo that I get along with, Nanzuka, and he's very involved with vernacular culture, pop culture. And so I did a solo show with an older artist, Tanami, one of the great artists, one of the best artists of the pop era, Sorayama, who's known more for pop culture, but now sort of working in the fine art area. And we sold a Sorayama rover to Elon Musk. And Elon wanted to connect with Sorayama. So we set up a Zoom call with translators, and Elon talked with Sorayama. I guess he wanted to send him up to space or something. And then at the end, we asked through the translator to Sorayama, so how was it? How was the conversation with Elon? And he said, Elon, he's an idiot. Yeah, and there's some really good younger artists we showed. There's Hiroshi, who makes these wooden figures all out of skateboards. And because I showed some artists who were very involved in street culture, like Barry McGee, who's a big hero in Japan, I've experienced this connection between kind of streetwear and that kind of whole culture and contemporary art. So like when Barry goes to Japan, does a show, there are 2,000 kids lining up. And so that's a really interesting thing that doesn't exist in the same way here.
Well, I think with Kusama, Nara, Murakami, they also have that, you know, that aspect of
Right.
the merchandise is, you know, as important as their, you know, artworks in a
Practice,
lot of
right.
ways.
Right.
And I remember working with Takashi, that, you know, of course, there was a Louis Vuitton boutique, but there was also his own, we had a whole Kai Kai Kiki room. And that was all products that Kai Kai Kiki, his factory, it was his studio had produced, and they even had newsletters and trinkets. And so that was as important for him to have next to the Louis Vuitton boutique. And I have the slide here of Tokyo Pop Underground, which was your recent show with
Happened here.
Nansuka.
So that's a Hiroshi. It's all made out of skateboards. He started as a skater.
Huge assemblage.
And how was the reception of this show here?
Oh, people loved it. We had a big audience. One of the favorite moment is Takashi came in without announcing himself and did his famous pose in front of the Hiroshi and put it on Instagram, and you know, people went crazy.
And what about this piece here? The installation?
Oh yeah, that's Soriyama.
Oh, Soriyama's.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting thing because he starts as a figurine artist coming out of that vernacular and then goes into fine art.
Yeah, and you really
Sort of
helped
a reversal of what Takashi is doing.
And you really helped him and Tanami in that sense too.
And then, you know, Keiji Tanami actually he passed away 2 years ago. I remember seeing his show at the National Art Center in Tokyo. I think he died during the run of the exhibition, but there were lines around the building, and I don't think that would have happened if his work wasn't as globally, you know, recognized. And so there's this term called gyakuyunyu, which is, you know, when artists are famous abroad, you know, in the US, they tend to become recognized. And unless that happens, it's hard for Japanese artists who stay in Japan to get the recognition.
A very interesting example is Ankawara. So Ankawara, one of the greatest conceptual artists. So he was quite successful in Japan, but he understood the limits, and he moved to the United States, maybe the late 60s, early 70s, and just started a new career, and very influential, but he understood he had to do that at that time.
I'm wondering if that's still the case today.
It's a good question. You know, as you know, like, traveling to Japan is now really cool. Like, so my art friends, fashion friends, I said, "What's up?" I said, "Oh, we're going to Japan." So it's the coolest destination now, and then galleries are starting up again. For a long time, there are almost no private collectors of note.
But now,
And now, you know, there are
Yeah, there's a
collectors
rising
who are very
generation.
active. You know more about that than I do. Maybe you can talk
well, there's a
about that.
rising generation of collectors, some of whom are real philanthropists. They're buying a lot of Japanese artwork and donating them to museums. And not only that, because museums don't have money to send their curators abroad, there's one collector in particular who is now funding a lot of the travel and research and trying to make sure that the curators have, because within the museum world, it's quite separate. It's been very separated in a way, unless you're really close with some of these museums. There's just like a separation, and it's not just about language. I think it just has to do with the lack of interaction with a lot of these. But now I think that the curators also are becoming more international. So that is really important. Yeah. in terms of the transnational exchange of both, showing Japanese art abroad, but also American and European artists, more, contemporary artists in Japan. Yeah.